and welcome to Esoterica and Nonsense, a podcast where we discuss myths, legends, folk tales, fairy tales, supernatural phenomenon, and religions from around the world. I'm your host, Annabelle, and today we are going to get into some weird, fringe, creepy shit. Today we are going to talk about the Third Reich, Hitler's obsession with ancient relics, and Hitler's micropenis. Yes, babe, buckle up because we are going to get into some deep, gritty details. Now, first and foremost, what I want to start with is giving some background about some new breakthroughs that have recently been done with some sequencing of Hitler's DNA. Now, it has been confirmed that they have found real samples of Hitler's DNA. They have done tests, and scientists have confirmed that Adolf Hitler had what is known as Kalman Syndrome. If you're new here on planet Earth, Hitler was a man in Germany who rose to power, appointed himself as a dictator, and is credited with starting the Jewish German Holocaust, which is literally what World War II is all about. Now, this is very recent. This is breaking news that through DNA sequencing, scientists were able to conclude that Hitler had what is known as Kalman syndrome. Now, I want to break down what Kalman syndrome is because one of the symptoms of Kalman syndrome is having a micropenis. However, this is not the cause of all micropenises. And just to clear the air, we are not here to shame anyone's sexuality, anyone's gender, and anyone's genitalia. However, one thing that I want everyone to think about, and something that has been on my mind, is the society that we have built that is built on misogyny and patriarchy, and how someone might be affected, especially somebody who's assigned male at birth, who grows up not experiencing a regular puberty and therefore socially is not considered a man, and how that may affect their psychology. So now let's get into it. I want to break down what Kalman syndrome is so you can understand exactly what Hitler was dealing with. And then we're going to dive deep into some of the weird, bizarre, esoteric, occult things that that Hitler and the Nazis were interested in. I'm telling you, we're going to go on a wild ride, babe. So buckle up. This is a great time for you to make a cup of tea because this is some hot tea. There's a lot to process here. Okay, so what is Kalman syndrome? Kalman syndrome is a genetic disorder that prevents a person from starting or fully completing puberty. This is what is known scientifically is hypogonadotropic hypogonadism. The idea that the gonads, the genitals, don't fully form into what is considered adult genitalia. Okay, so this is a very specific kind of underdevelopment, right? There are other instances where a person may have an underdeveloped genitalia. This is a very specific kind. Essentially, I'm bastardizing this. I'm going to make it as simple as possible so that we can understand it. But essentially, Kalman syndrome has to do with a deficiency and or a lack your body's unable to process the hormones that are associated with sexuality, such as testosterone or estrogen. Kalman syndrome is much more common in men than it is in women. And in a nutshell, your body goes through multiple puberties. It's not truly a real puberty, but around 3 months, a baby will be affected by these hormones, the 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 sex hormones such as estrogen or testosterone. A child born with Kalman syndrome is affected as a baby, usually in utero, for either genetic reasons or external reasons, and they will basically not have this first wave of puberty. They won't experience this first mini puberty as a baby. And then, of course, in their actual pubescent years, they will also not experience the same puberty. So what happens, it's obviously easier to identify in males. Their penis and testicles are often underdeveloped and often look incredibly small. And sometimes in females, this can be having a flat chest. Um, the other thing that is really interesting as well is that it is common that people with Kalman syndrome will have a lack of sense of smell and sometimes a total lack of sense of smell. And sometimes they can deal with things such as osteoporosis, infertility, and even having issues with their kidneys working properly. Now, the thing that really blew my mind, though, is that interestingly, you would think that without having a puberty, that they would miss out on these pubescent feelings. We've all been through puberty. Puberty can have a lot of angst, a lot of anger, a lot of like pent up angst. And fascinatingly, individuals with Kalman syndrome often will have this angst throughout their life. Now, this is a generalization, and obviously those with more testosterone are more likely to have an angstier puberty. But it has been noted in multiple cases that individuals with Kalman syndrome are often struggle with managing their anger. Hmm. Hmm. Now, another thing I do want to mention is that I have done my own research on Kalman syndrome. And one thing I find really fascinating, and one thing I want to really get specific about, is what they mean by micropenis. Penises come in very many sizes, and there are some penises that are very small. I did go online and I researched Kalman syndrome, and I have seen pictures, and in some pictures, the penis almost looked more like a clitoris. We're talking really small. And again, there is nothing wrong with the diversity of genitalia. I think the diversity of humanity, everything is gorgeous, beautiful. And I want to add that I do wish that we lived in a society where individuals were celebrated and had a place in the world. Now, if you have not listened to my episode about non-binary individuals and their role in ancient society, I highly recommend giving it a listen. But just learning about Kalman syndrome, I am interested, and this just kind of came to my mind, that perhaps if a baby who was assigned male at birth was born with Kalman syndrome and had a very, very, very underdeveloped penis, that perhaps they would be chosen as this third gender or this intermediate gender and perhaps be put in a spiritual role in society. Now, we obviously don't know. I don't know if that is true or not, but I am interested that perhaps if we lived in a world where we were not so obsessed over each other's sexual performance, penis size, what have you, if we were allowed to live between the binary, would individuals turn out differently? There's just my hypothesis. That's something I just want you to think about. And now I want to get into the gritty details of the Third Reich and their obsession with holy relics. And I guess my hot take is perhaps Hitler was so obsessed with ancient relics because perhaps he was looking for magic. He was searching for a means of magic to increase his penis size. Is that so crazy to believe? Perhaps not. They were doing meth every day and they were looking for the Holy Grail. So is it so crazy to believe that they thought that they could increase their penis size via magic? Who knows? Okay, so let's get into it. Hitler was born in 1889 on April 20th. He was born on 4/20. Fascinatingly, he was actually Austrian, which I think I knew, but I forgot. And this is actually a really interesting part of Hitler's psychology. One thing, though, that I misunderstood is I grew up learning that Hitler's mother was Jewish or partly Jewish, and this actually is not true. Hitler's mother was devoutly Catholic. However, it is possible that one of Hitler's father's ancestors could have been Jewish. It is not, it's not totally sure. So he was born in Austria. His father was actually a customs officer, which totally fucking checks out. Like, customs officials are the fucking worst. Okay, so Hitler's dad worked for a customs office, and they traveled around when he was a kid. So he was Austrian and born in Austria, but eventually they were transferred to a part of Austria that was very close to Bavaria. And so as Hitler was young, he developed an accent that was much more German than it was Austrian. And that's something he carried with pride. And then eventually, as he got older, he actually started taking a lot of pride in being German and started creating a resentment to this idea of diversity, and this idea of having borders that embraced outsiders. He was very proudly German and wanted to celebrate Germanic pride. Another really big aspect of Hitler's life, which I find fascinating, which ties into this Kalman syndrome, is that there was a turning point when he was around middle school where his parents and his teachers noted that he was incredibly violent and incredibly rude. His younger sister started saying that by the time he was in about middle school age, he was really violent with her. And he started developing a hatred towards his father. And his father was often very violent with Hitler. And he wanted Hitler to become a customs officer, which is laughable. I'm sorry. Um, And so Hitler basically kind of created this persona that was all about antagonizing his father. Anything his father wanted him to do, he didn't want to do. And so Hitler actually wanted to go to art school, and his father wouldn't let him. His father was insistent that he would have to go to a regular school and that he would have to become a customs officer. Hitler hated school and he purposely tried to fail out of school so his father would transfer him. And I think this is really fascinating. I think this psychology is really fascinating. Of course, all of us have been teenagers. All of us have rebelled and struggled with navigating our relationships with our parents, navigating our relationships with the political climate and the world at large. But I think it's really fascinating now that we know that he had Kalman syndrome and never really experienced a true puberty, that his relationship with his father and his relationship with his identity could have been very much driven by this need to overperform as a man, right? This idea that like a man is strong, a man is stronger than another man, a man imposes his will. Like all of these ideas with patriarchy of what a man is, he may have been propelled to overperform these things because in a lot of ways, he had to overcompensate. Another thing I wanted to mention is that it is often common for people with Kalman syndrome to not experience a sex drive because truly their gonads, their genitals have not fully developed and they don't experience the same hormonal changes when it comes to their genitals. Now, we don't really know what was going on with Hitler. Every single person with Kalman syndrome is different, and I am not an expert on this. So again, like this is based off the research I've done, but I do think that this is something to note. Also, actually, the one thing I forgot, unsurprisingly, another symptom of having Kalman syndrome is not necessarily having the same develop of an Adam's apple in a male, and therefore not having as deep as a voice. And I did learn that in Hitler's youth, he actually sang for a choir and he was thought about he thought about becoming a singer, and he sang for the choir at church for many years. And it is very possible that in public, as Hitler got older, he would be performing a low voice. He would be purposely making his voice lower because it is possible that naturally his voice was a little bit higher as he really didn't have the same amount of testosterone. Uh, okay, so One thing that I really want to stress, and I think this is interesting, as I mentioned, Hitler sang for a choir, and he was raised devoutly Catholic. He was baptized at birth, he was confirmed in his pubescent years, and he went to Catholic school most of his life. And he was also an altar boy. He had an early fascination with ritual of iconography and the biblical prophecy, which obviously later he reshaped into a twisted ideology. So, as Hitler grew up, he rejected traditional Christianity and he decided and believed that Christianity was a religion of weakness. He admired pagan and pre Christian Germanic traditions and what is known as the Teutonic Knights and the myths of divine bloodlines. And I do think this is really fascinating. He became so proudly German that a lot of more ancient ideas of the Germanic people became really important to him and things that he really embraced. And he started doing more research into older religions and older sects of Christianity. Unsurprisingly, Adolf Hitler saw himself as an agent of destiny chosen to restore the sacred Aryan order. And we're going to get into like part of how he came to that conclusion, but I also think that this is just a personal hot take, but I do think that, if he was truly living life with a completely underdeveloped genitalia, was not really able to pursue romances, may not have been even interested to pursue romances, that he would have really just had more time on his hands. And I think it would have been easier for him, especially as a boy, to kind of start having visions of grandeur and seeing himself as the chosen one, and kind of like almost needing that to feel justified, to feel worthy, to feel important. And this is another reason why I think we really need to dismantle the patriarchy, because the patriarchy is so damaging. It's not, in my opinion, it's not really about like male versus female or really about gender. I think the idea of patriarchy is the idea of monarchy, the idea of someone being more important than someone else, the idea of competition being the driving force of humanity. I fundamentally disagree with these ideals, and I think it creates an unsafe environment for humans to be growing up and functioning. I think community values, which is what matriarchy is all about, the idea of community, the idea of connectedness, the idea that no one person is better or worse, the idea that we really all are one. We all are a shared consciousness, right? This is something that I think creates a healthier society. And I do think that a lot of Hitler's ideals are symptoms of a patriarchal society, and perhaps symptoms of feeling like an outsider and needing to perform, needing to survive, needing to prove to other men that he is the manliest man, right? To me, that this is what this is giving. Let's take a quick break. Are you a fan of the podcast and want everyone to know? Well, guess what? We have merch live. There are sweatshirts, t-shirts, tank tops, water bottles, stickers, all kinds of things. There's also some other like random fun things of my personal art. But why not get a tote bag, a tumbler, and a hoodie to tell the world that you listen to the pod? Check it out. There's a link in the description of this video and a link in the description of my podcast and channel. Check me out, babe. Okay, so as I mentioned, Adolf Hitler was becoming a teenager. He started rejecting a lot of Christian norms and ideals and started embracing older pagan and Germanic beliefs. However, he promoted what was considered a quasi-religious system known as positive Christianity, which removed the Jewish roots of Christianity and rebranded Jesus as an Aryan warrior fighting against Jewish corruption. Now, obviously, this is a little bit insane because, as we all know, Jesus was Jewish. However, Jesus was very much against the religious corruption that has was prevalent at the time. And something that is worth noting is that throughout Europe for hundreds of years, the Jewish people were persecuted and often used as scapegoats for all kinds of random things, especially during the Middle Ages. Um, Jewish people would be blamed for thunderstorms or fires. I mean, like literally any random thing that you can imagine. It became very convenient for people, and specifically the Christian church, to blame Jewish populations for all kinds of silly things. And they would often cast them out of their villages, cast them out of their cities. And so Jewish people became nomadic. And so they started being associated with bad luck. They started being associated as outsiders. They started being associated as like, Easterners, whatever. There was all kinds of terrible and racist tropes around Jewish people that persisted long before Adolf Hitler was alive. And so I do think it's really interesting and important to remember that his hate for the Jewish people was not completely made up. This was reinforced by the society he lived in and reinforced by this idea he had of being like pro-German, and that being German was this legacy that was ancient and powerful and mystical, and that any outsider was like impure. Any outsider was taking away from this magic, this idealist magic that Germany had. Um, and this is something that I feel like isn't really talked about. At least I wasn't taught in schools. Growing up in the United States, we studied World War II, and specifically what they called the Holocaust. I call it the German Holocaust because there have been other Holocausts throughout history, but we studied this for over a month in the eighth grade. And I don't remember once learning about Hitler's fascination with the occult and Hitler's fascination with ancient relics of the Bible and his fascination with Germanic folklore and pre-Christian pagan ideals. And I do think it's a really important aspect of his psychology that plays into why he was so against Judaism and against the Jewish people. He truly thought of them as like taking away of like the Germanic legacy, not just like racially. He really like believed in this magic that had been tainted with the Old Testament. Like the New Testament was a reformation of what the Old Testament was, which was like dirty and wrong. So it's pretty wild. So ultimately, Adolf Hitler believed in a cosmic battle between light and darkness. Often his politics spoke of this apocalyptic and this like very messiah driven language. He really thought of himself as a messiah who was delivering people from an apocalyptic future. So, one thing, and we're going to get into it a little bit, but I'm going to like touch over a lot of the things that he was doing, the things that were happening as he was rising to power, and then I'm going to get into some deeper stuff of like where this obsession really came from. So, another really big reason why Hitler came to power is obviously the people he surrounded himself with. He started doing a lot of public speaking. He was in the military, and then he basically became surrounded by other people who were fully agreeing with him. And a lot of the people he surrounded himself with had a lot of esoteric ideologies. They were interested in astrology, in rune magic, and even myths about Atlantis. Eventually, there was an SS research division founded by Heinrich Himmler in 1935, known as the Ahnenerbe. Ahnenerbe. My German listeners, please correct me. Essentially, this research division was dedicated to proving the divine and ancient origins of the Aryan race, and more specifically, the Germanic people. They were really fascinated with these Germanic beliefs, runes, and astrology and divination. They were dedicated to learning about the archaeology, the anthropology, and the occult pseudoscience of Western Europe to justify Nazi radical theories. Hmm. Why is it that we never learned this? In school, I was taught this was really just all about racism. And of course, this is completely racist. But I was never informed about the obsession with the esoteric and the occult. And I find that fascinating. So these were some of the obsessions that the Nazis had and what they were searching for, not only to covet and to use for their magical powers, but also to prove the superiority of the Germanic race. So, of course, oh my gosh, pardon me. Of course, unsurprisingly, they were obsessed with the Holy Grail. This is kind of the most famous relic that the Nazis were searching for. The Holy Grail is also known as the Cup of Christ. It is believed that the Holy Grail is the cup that Jesus drank out of during the Last Supper. However, some people believe that instead of this being a cup, that it actually could be a stone, the Philosopher's Stone. It is believed that the Holy Grail will grant eternal life and divine right to those who use it. And so Himmler, who was um, a part of this research division of the occult, was the one who was most obsessed with the Holy Grail. He was just like completely taken, obsessed with the search for the Holy Grail. And that was kind of his mission as a Nazi. He just, all he wanted to do was find the Holy Grail. And he had this kind of idea of creating the Nazi party like based off of the Knights of the Round Table. He was obsessed with this myth of King Arthur and wanted to recreate the Knights of the Round Table, and that was a big reason why he was searching for the Holy Grail. He eventually transformed Willisburg Castle into a neo-pagan Grail temple and designed a spiritual center for the SS. I'm not joking, this is real fucking life. So, on their quest for the Holy Grail, Himmler reinterpreted the Grail not as a Christian relic, but as a symbol of Aryan mystical power. Which again is so fucking laughable because Jesus is literally a Palestinian. Like, what? But whatever. Like, you do you, Himmler. He was influenced by Otto Rand's theories, who was another Germanic man of the time, and essentially Himmler believed that the Grail was connected to the Cathar treasure traditions and that the Holy Grail was most likely hidden in the Pyrenees in France. We're going to get into the Cathars, but the Cathars were essentially a pseudo-Gnostic sect of Christians that eventually were persecuted through multiple crusades and inquisitions in the medieval period. They were completely wiped out by the Catholic Church. And like that's a whole other thing. But Hitler and Himmler really modeled themselves after this Cathar belief system, which started in around France and Italy. Also, Himmler believed that the Holy Grail represented spiritual purification and supernatural authority that could legitimize the Nazi Empire. It was seen as the ultimate symbol of the divine right to rule. He imagined a mystical Germanic order, like the Knights of the Round Table, centered around this castle as the Grail as its spiritual core. And there's literally documentation of this. The Nazis were going all over Europe and were obsessed specifically with France. They were going to sites where the Cathars were. They were raiding the catacombs of Paris. They were convinced that they would be able to find the Holy Grail in France. Interestingly, there were many more objects that they were obsessed with finding. Another one being the Spear of Destiny or the Holy Lance. I didn't really know about this magical object, but this was the spear that allegedly pierced Jesus's side as he was sent to his death. Certain Nazi circles, especially those around Hitler, believed that the spear granted irresistible power to whoever possessed it, possibly even the ability to control the fate of the world. I'm sorry. This is this is giving a meth fantasy. Like, tell me you're doing meth without telling me that you're smoking meth. Like, why why is it that the spear that pierced Jesus's side gives you irresistible power? Like, what? Babe, you're fucking crazy. Like, what? No, this is like truly insane. So, it was said that the Spear of Destiny was kept in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, and after annexing Austria, the Nazis seized it. Some believed it validated Hitler's destiny to rise to power. Now, I personally don't believe, like, whatever spear they're talking about, I believe that there was a spear in Vienna that they seized. I have trouble believing that it was the fucking spear that pierced Jesus's. There's just no way. There is no fucking way. It is important to note that historically, Hitler's personal belief in the magic of the Spear of Destiny is debated, but Himmler himself encouraged the reverence for it, and other Nazis believed in its power, and that is important. Other Nazis believed that because they had this spear, it was part of destiny. It was proof that Hitler was like the chosen one. Of course, another hilarious and unsurprising obsession of theirs was Excalibur. I like, I have to laugh. I have to fucking laugh because now learning about all of this, it seems so balls to the wall insane that this could literally fuel an entire movement to genocide a group of people and to start like a cultural revolution. But of course, like, I think there were so many things happening in Germany at the time. After World War One, Germans were devastated. It became really easy to start blaming outsiders and blaming almost like the what's the word I'm looking for? Like, blaming the movement of the world moving towards diversity and moving towards integration. This idea that like we're actually perfect if we go back to our roots, our perfect Germanic Aryan roots. Like that's where we sh that's where we belong, you know? But it is just so fucking nuts to me that they were literally looking for Excalibur. And they were. Nazis were looking for Excalibur, also known as Siegfried's sword. Himmler was obsessed with the German epic known as Nibelungenlied. And he saw Siegfried's sword as a prototype of an ancient Aryan hero king weapon. Himmler believed these legends encoded ancient mystical truths about racial purity, divine kingship, and heroic rebirth. Oh my God. So, this research center that I mentioned earlier, one of their purposes was to search for physical evidence of these myths. So, they would like read Germanic myths and then to literally search for physical evidence. They were going to all kinds of villages all over Europe to find relics. Himmler used the sword motif as part of the SS initiation symbolism. Unsurprising. I mean, also just to be clear, in most Western countries, they still use the sword as initiation rituals. Like if you're knighted by the queen to this day, or I guess the king now, they like do the whole sword thing on the shoulder. That's like literally from like the Arthur myth. Like I'm telling you, like this is fucking textbook. Another thing that the Nazis were fascinated with was runes. They believed that runes were not only letters, but magical sigils containing energy from the ancestors. And to be clear, runes were used in divination in different parts of Scandinavia and the Germanic world. They believed that each rune represented a metaphysical principle, such as fertility, power, protection, death, and fate, which is also true. In Germanic cultures and Scandinavian cultures, they did think of runes almost as archetypes and divination tools. Fascinatingly, which I didn't realize this, the SS logo was derived from a sig rune, believed to channel victory energy. Initiation Initiations in the SS involved rune symbolism, especially the Tiwas, the Algis, and the Othala runes. Another thing that they were fascinated and obsessed with was what was known as the crystal skull. This is a Mesoamerican skull legend. Himmler and some other members of their research facility believed that crystal skulls were ancient Atlantean or pre-Aryan artifacts. They saw them as evidence of a lost master race that brought technology and mysticism around the world. At least one expedition tried to acquire crystal skulls for study, believing they could store psychic energy or spiritual knowledge. Like, like crazy. And then, of course, they were obsessed with the Ark of the Covenant. Many members of the Nazi Party believed that the Ark of the Covenant was actually an ancient energy device and not just a religious object. If you don't know, the Ark of the Covenant is basically this like chest. It's like a gold chest that they believe was a critical part of Jesus's power. Um, Hold on, actually, I have some notes on this because I'm still the Ark of the Covenant. Like, what the fuck is the Ark of the Covenant? I always just think of Indiana Jones. Oh yes, okay, so it's a sacred chest. It was believed by many of the ancient Jewish people to be a physical manifestation of God's presence. It was constructed from acacia wood and overlaid with pure gold, and it contains stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. Okay, there we go. Okay, so much older than Jesus's time. This is where the Ten Commandments were stored. So, the Nazis were obsessed with finding the Ark of the Covenant, and they thought of it as an ancient energy device. The idea was popular among fringe occultists within the regime, though not officially pursued like the Grail. Now, this is what I think is the most fascinating. One thing which I never realized is that Himmler and some of the Nazi Party were obsessed with Tibetan ritual objects. And of course, I guess I should have known because if you didn't realize, the swastika is actually a reappropriated ancient symbol that is used all around India, Nepal, and Tibet. Um, when it's flipped the other direction, it's basically the wheel of eternity, the wheel of life. And the Nazis flipped the direction of it and used it as a symbol of the Nazi Party. What I didn't realize, though, is that the Nazis believed that Tibetan Buddhism preserved fragments of the ancient Aryan wisdom, and they were trying to prove through their research that Tibetans were actually a part of the Aryan race somehow, that they were distantly related. Let that sink in. Let's take a quick break. Hi, it's me, Annabelle, and if you've made it this far, I appreciate you so much. Please like and subscribe my channel, my page. I have so many kinds of content and I'm working on new kinds. You may be listening to me just through my podcast or through YouTube. You should check out my YouTube if you're not watching or listening to me there. I have meditation videos. I have yoga videos coming soon. I have my full length podcast. I'm doing short episodes. I'm doing shorts, and soon I'm going to be having listener episodes. So, like, subscribe. Thanks, babe. Love you. So, I know, if you're like me, you're gobsmacked right now. I can't believe it. The Nazis would work with ritual objects such as vajras, which were thunderbolts, mandalas, and skull cups from Tibet, and they believed these to be remnants of an ancient Indo-European spiritual tradition. You're kidding me. Himmler believed that Tibetans were distant cousins of the Aryan race and possessed esoteric wisdom that the SS could reclaim. I'm flabbergasted. I'm fucking flabbergasted. I I'm so fascinated with how anyone can feel justified with starting a genocide. If you don't know, here on this podcast, we're against genocide. There's no way you can convince me that a genocide is okay or has any valid reason. I'm against all genocide. And I do think, though, that we really need to study why genocides happen, how a person or a group of people, a nation of people, can support a genocide and the psychology behind that. And I do think one thing that's really important to recognize is that often people who experience incredible trauma, people who experience violence themselves, often, and sometimes it takes generations, will find ways to justify a genocide. Often there's also a lot of propaganda that goes into it. But I do think that there is something here. There is something with this mixture of pride in one's nationalism, pride in patriotism, and also having an underdeveloped penis and kind of like a disdain for your parents, a disdain for all the hardships that your country has gone through, and finding an easy group to blame. It is all connected. It also just kind of reminds me of being a teenager because when I was a teenager, and I am generalizing, but in my experience of teenagers, like a big part of being a teenager is kind of like you against the world and really kind of blaming everything. You blame everything. And for good reason. You know, when you were a kid, you didn't really have a lot of autonomy, you didn't have a lot of control. So often, I think a healthy part of being a teenager is just kind of seeing everything wrong with the world, starting to point out, like, this is wrong. I don't agree. This is wrong. I don't agree. This is your fault. And you often blame your parents, or you blame society, or you blame the political climate. And it's easy to do. You didn't really create any of that. But I do just think it's fascinating that Hitler became fixated on erasing a group of people because to me that does seem like a teenage reaction to something. Like it's all about blaming. And once this person or this group of people pays, like all your problems will be fixed. You know what I'm saying? Like it's a very juvenile thought process. Even this idea of searching for all these um ancient relics. I actually support, I think we should be doing more research on the esoteric, but like to do it because it proves your divine right to rule. Like this is all very juvenile to me, and I do think that's like really, I think that's a really important thing to integrate, and I think something that hasn't been studied enough. I also wonder, um, like how many famous dictators in history perhaps had something similar. It would kind of make sense. If you have nothing but time on your hands, you're not really able to date a woman in a traditional way that society expects you to, and you're a man who very much wants to be considered strong and powerful. I could see that it would be a motivating reason to climb the ranks of politics. Just saying. So, now I really want to get into this meat. Why is it that Hitler got to this place of obsessing about all these relics and specifically the Holy Grail? Why was he so obsessed with the Holy Grail? Of course, it was this idea of it being a symbol of his rulership, but I really want to get into like how he went down this path. And essentially, as a teenager, he started doing his own research and discovered the Cathars. The Cathars were a group of Christians who kind of split off and started their own movement and eventually were hunted down by the Catholic Church. Fascinating stuff. And I think this is a really important thing to understand if we want to understand Hitler's psychology and beliefs. So, the Cathars were mainly practicing in an area of France known as Languedoc. Oh, I'm probably saying that wrong. Languedoc. Um, this was in medieval times, and they were said to guard a secret divine knowledge. And it is believed that possibly they protected the Holy Grail and perhaps came from a sacred bloodline. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is Nazi language, sacred bloodline, totally. So, Nazi archaeologists influenced by texts and things that they had read about the Cathars believed that the Holy Grail was a symbol of the pure Aryan spirit, as we know. So they started sending expeditions to seek proof of the Nordic ancestry among Tibetan monks, believing them to be descendants of the Aryan civilization, blah, blah, blah. So specifically, the Cathars became an obsession of Adolf Hitler because they were pseudo they were a group of pseudo Gnostics. So essentially, they believed that the God written about in the Old Testament was actually the devil, um, which is really fascinating because this is another reason that played into Hitler's belief that Jewish people were essentially like people of the devil. So it is believed that the word Cathar comes from the Greek term Catharai, which means pure ones. Ooh. And they flourished between the year 1000 and 1300 CE in the province of France, Occitania. So, and parts of northern Italy. So, like I mentioned, they were considered pseudo-Gnostic, and ultimately they believed in a good God. This was the creator of the spiritual world, a pure and luminous entity, and they believed in an evil God, which Catholics would consider Satan. But this evil God is the creator of the material world. So essentially, this would be the God from the Old Testament would be considered a evil God because he created the material world. So the Cathars saw the physical reality as prison and crafted by a dark power. They believed that human souls were angelic beings trapped in flesh by an evil creator. Life was about escaping the cycle of reincarnation and returning to the realm of light. There is definitely some almost like Hindu, Tibetan ideas like woven into this. I can see why perhaps the Nazis were thinking that like Tibetan beliefs were related to the Cathars. I get where they're coming from, but this is pretty nuts. So they also believed in Jesus as a spiritual being. They believed that Jesus did not ever actually take physical form because matter itself is evil. So they believed that the body of Jesus was actually a passion, and it was basically an illusion of passion, a teaching tool. And so he was able to manifest as almost like a holograph for people. And they believed that Jesus' mission was to reveal how to free the soul from the material world. Cathars were strictly vegetarian, and sometimes they would eat fish because they believed that fish were unable to reproduce sexually, which is a really big part of their belief because once somebody became a priest of the Cathars, they were unable to engage in sex. They deeply believed in nonviolence and they believed in gender equality, which we love. They did not observe the Eucharist, so they did not eat the bread at church. They did not believe in marriage because it created more physical ties, and they did not believe in baptism as water is also part of the material world. In the Cathar tradition, they had two tiers. There was believers who were basically regular people who followed the teachings. They were known as the credentes, and then there was the perfecti, the perfect ones, and these were the spiritually awakened elites who lived in extreme purity. They were celibate, they would fast, they lived simplistically, they would pray constantly, and they engaged in a lot of manual labor. They were believed to have angelic purity on earth. So, unsurprisingly, the Vatican hated the Cathars. They hated them. They viewed them as heretics. They thought of them as a direct threat to the authority of the Vatican. They were a competing version of Christianity. They also challenged the idea of wealth and land control, and they were becoming very popular in the first 3 centuries of the tens. That doesn't really make sense. Basically, you know what I'm saying. Between the year 1000 and 1300, they were gaining popularity. And so the Vatican would not stand for it. So, as the story goes, this church declared holy war on the Cathars. In 1209, there was the siege of Béziers. There was a slaughter of the Cathars. Quote, the papal legislate said, quote, kill them all. God will know his own. Don't we? It never ceases to amaze me that people who believe in religions that preach nonviolence and loving all living things will find ways to use their beliefs to justify murder, love. It is said that during this first Holy War in 1209, the siege of Béziers, up to 20,000 people were killed in the region of northern France and southern Italy. Nope, southern France, northern Italy. That's what I meant. This crusade devastated southern France for over 20 years. And then eventually, later on, one of the largest Cathar buildings. It was a large convent, essentially known as Monseigneur. They refused to renounce their faith, and over 200 of them were burned alive in a massive pyre at the foot of the mountains. So they literally had a mass burning for the Cathar peoples. So Jesus, not sorry, oh my God, that was a Freudian slip. Jesus Christ. Adolf Hitler became obsessed with the Cathars. He became obsessed with this idea that the Old Testament was wrong and that, Jesus himself was a reformationist and basically preaching all these ancient ideals, and really the idea being that like the Old Testament is evil. And this kind of makes sense, right? That he would be obsessed with the Cathars because they, in a nutshell, it wasn't really about race for them, but they believed that the Old Testament was not correct and that people were basically worshiping a false god. And that's really what Gnosticism is all about. And Hitler really took it to the next level, believing that it was really about purity of blood, that like people of Jewish descent are not only worshiping a devil, but like they are descendants of a devil, if you will. So, while there is no historical proof that the Cathars held the Holy Grail, there were several legends throughout history that connected the Cathars to the Holy Grail. One of them being Wolfram von Eschenbach. In the 13th century, a German epic that redefines the Holy Grail not as a chalice, but as a stone of divine knowledge. This German epic is known as Parzival. So this was written in the 13th century. So this would have been the 1400s. No, the 1200s, right? Yes, the 1200s. And this German epic is describing the Holy Grail as a stone of divine knowledge, basically the sorcerer's stone. The Grail keepers are known as the Templars, but many believe that Eschenbach used the Cathar and Troubadour sources, right? So people are believing that this German writer modeled this epic after the Cathar tradition. They also believed that this last stronghold of the Cathars, where they were eventually burned alive, known as Montségur, was known as the Grail Castle. There were some esoteric groups that believed that this was a fortress for the Holy Grail, and the geometry of the castle is aligned with solar events like ritual solar temples. So, first, at this point, centuries, people are believing that the Cathars had the Holy Grail, mostly based off of this Germanic epic written in the 1200s. They also believe that the Cathars held secret manuscripts, esoteric teachings, and other sacred objects that had been lost through history. Himmler believed that the Cathars preserved a pure Aryan mystery. Their treasure could validate the Nazi mythic history, and the Grail was hidden in the Pyrenees Mountains. So, the SS conducted expeditions in the Cathar regions, specifically looking for the Holy Grail, the Stone of Light, the Philosopher's Stone, and hidden esoteric texts, all to prove an Aryan bloodline cult. Classic. So, what is really an important takeaway that is not talked about enough is that Hitler viewed ancient myth as a tool for mass control, a way to bind the German people under a shared sacred narrative. The Holy Grail and other ancient relics were not merely just treasure hunts, they were a part of a metaphysical war for legitimacy. The Third Reich saw itself as the rebirth of a divine empire, reclaiming relics of power to sanctify their conquest. And in a weird, creepy way, they were believing they were helping the world by ridding the people who believed in this false god, the people who were worshiping the devil, and that their blood was impure by doing so. Craziness. It was also said that as the Nazis spread through Europe, they were obsessed with raiding France, Poland, and Austria and made many attempts to seize the Vatican archives. They were obsessed with finding like hidden relics of the ancient world. Of course, they never found the Holy Grail, and in the end, Hitler's mythic empire collapsed under the weight of his own delusions. We all kind of know how the story goes. The Nazis were doing a bunch of meth, and at this point, the whole world was waging war upon them. So everything just kind of fizzled out. But I am left wondering how much of Hitler's psychology comes down to him being an angry teenager and hating the world and needing a reason to feel valid and feel powerful. I'm left wondering how angry he must have been and how much his anger may have fueled his decisions, not just against Jews or against um, homosexuals or against trans people or against all kinds of people. Because as we know, the German Holocaust was not actually just about Jewish people. They also sent other people of color to concentration camps, people who were known to be gay, people who were basically just thought to not fit into these ideals and in a weird way, Christian ideals. Perhaps his anger and obsession with policing people and purity came from his insecurity as a man, his insecurity that under the patriarchy, he may not even be considered a man. And again, I mean, we really don't know what other things may have happened to him in his childhood. We don't really know if perhaps he had been mocked or experienced large embarrassment. That we we won't know unless some kind of stories resurface. But I do think it's really important to think about these things, and this is just kind of like my PSA for all humanity. This is why it's also important to let go of this idea of gender binary. Of course, Adolf Hitler was a man. He was an XY chromosome. He was a boy. He identified as a man. But what does it mean for a person who may not even be able to engage in penetration, right? He, he his particular case could have been so that his penis was so underdeveloped that it looked almost like a clitoris. And imagine, I imagine that some and or many men with this syndrome may experience incredible embarrassment and shame based on the society we live in. I hope they don't feel that way. But I think it's very possible that they may experience very strong emotions and a sense of shame and feeling like an outsider. And if you mix that with a prolonged puberty emotionally, I can easily see that resulting in bully-like behavior, right? Wanting to enforce their biggest fears, the thing that they fear the most, persecution, embarrassment, being outcast, to enforce that onto others. And I see this time and time again. It seems as if humans are just playing out juvenile fears on each other. It seems as if for the last 2,000 years in Europe, there has been an adolescent like attitude that people cannot grow out of. I feel like I could talk about this forever, but alas, the last thing I want you to be thinking about going forwards is this idea of patriarchy. And really, what I mean by patriarchy is a competition based society. Does it make sense for us to be appointing men who utilize militaries, who utilize war, who utilize intimidation to be ruling large groups of people? Now we can all look back and laugh at how silly and insane Hitler's beliefs were. But how is it that thousands of people were on board and excited to go along with him? There are other genocides happening right now. And sadly, there are many people, thousands of people who seem to be completely on board, who are fighting and murdering people with pride. How does this happen? And perhaps if we can dismantle patriarchy, if we can dismantle this society that we have built en masse that is based on competition, control, exploitation, we can start getting into the deeper roots of ourselves. We can start sifting through our shadow. Because obviously, Hitler is just one example here, but perhaps psychologically, the reason why we can continue with war and human exploitation and killing each other is because deep down, everyone is dealing with some kind of insecurity and some kind of self-hatred that allows them to project that outwards. That's just my hot take. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you so much. I do this for fun. If you like the podcast, please give me a good review, like, subscribe, email into the podcast. I appreciate you so much. And we need more kind people here on planet Earth. So I appreciate you so much. do something kind for someone that you love today, and I'll catch you next time.